Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means.
Hi there, I'm Sarah, the producer of State of Play. This week's episode was recorded in the morning of October 14th, 2025, with our guest host, Catherine Nzuki. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, listeners. This is Catherine Nzuki, an associate fellow with the Africa program here at CSIS, stepping in for Will Todman, who is feeling under the weather. And today, we're talking all ASEAN. This morning, the foreign minister of Malaysia, Mohammed Hassan, announced that President Trump will be attending the next summit of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The ASEAN Summit will be held in Kuala Lumpur from October 26th to October 28th, and leaders from all over the world have been invited, including the Premier of China, the Prime Minister of India, and the presidents of Brazil and South Africa. But of course, the one likely to get all the attention will be President Trump. He plans on overseeing the formal peace deal between Cambodia and Thailand on the sidelines of the summit. And it was unclear until this morning if he would attend. And if he does, it will be the first time he's been to an ASEAN summit since 2017. And during his first term, his lack of attendance was interpreted as disinterest in the bloc, which some said allowed it to drift towards China. Will has told me that I'm not allowed to say that this summit is occurring, quote, amid rising tensions between the U.S. and China. And Henrietta, I'm informed that you have...
my enduring legacy.
Yes, you have explicitly banned that. But U.S. China ties are certainly going along a bumpy road at the moment. At the time of recording, we don't know if the U.S. will be imposing even more sanctions on China, if the rumored Trump-Xi meeting is on or not, or what is really going on. But it does seem like these questions will continue to dominate the headlines over the next week. To unpack all of this, I am joined by two of our brightest minds here at CSIS. I'm joined by Greg Poling. He is the director of our Southeast Asia program and recently organized the Manila Strategy Forum with the president of the Philippines. Welcome, Greg.
Welcome, and may I just say how nice it is to get our new host in the chair. You know, I'm reminded of the 2001 New England Patriots season when Drew Bledsoe went down with an injury early on and a young Tom Brady stepped in, won the first of many Super Bowls, and the rest was history. But I wish Will
That's exactly what I was also thinking.
Yeah.
And this is not the first time I've been compared to Tom Brady, and it certainly will not be the last.
Drew Bledsoe got to go on and play for the Bills for a couple of seasons, so I'm sure we can find Will a nice replacement podcast to settle into an early retirement.
You know, there are other think tanks out there. And of course, Henrietta Levin is the senior fellow in the Freeman Chair for China Studies, back for her now third appearance on State of Play. Welcome, Henrietta.
Thrilled to be here.
Well, I didn't expect to be compared to such elite athletes this early in the
As a Ravens fan,
episode.
I've never said something nice about Tom Brady before, but...
Look, State of Play is elite podcasting.
Thank you.
It is.
Well, I'm in just fantastic company. And so, you know, before we get to the ASEAN conference and what we can expect, Greg, I just want to get your help in grounding this conversation. It seems like the core focus of Trump's visit is signing this peace agreement between Cambodia and Thailand. Can you just give us an overview of why tensions flared this summer and what role the U.S. played in mediating this conflict?
So we had this short, sharp border war between Thailand and Cambodia in late July. Cambodia clearly got the worst of it. Now, what precipitated the conflict is he said, she said, depending on which side you ask. But the root of the conflict boils down, as so many things in mainland Southeast Asia, to bad French maps and disagreements over where the boundary line between Cambodia and Thailand is supposed to lie, particularly around a handful of symbolically very important temples to both sides. And this for cartographic nerds, basically comes down to the scale of the two maps that two sides use. Now, regardless, the Cambodian government utilized the war to help bring down, at the time, the Thai government, which is a whole separate story. So the prime minister of Thailand that will be attending the ASEAN Summit is not the one who was at the helm during that short conflict. The conflict, at least for the time being, ended in a ceasefire mediated by Anwar Ibrahim, the prime minister of Malaysia. The U.S. came in at something close to the 11th hour with a personal intervention by Trump over the weekend, when at the time I think he was traveling in the UK, and called both Hun Manet, who's the prime minister of Cambodia, and at the time Paetongtarn Shinawatra, the now ousted prime minister of Thailand, and kind of, well, actually, I apologize. I believe it was the caretaker prime minister. We've now had 4 prime ministers in Thailand in the last 13 months, or something like that. So my apologies. But essentially threatened that neither of them would get tariff deals if they didn't stop. So there's a fair bit of debate, as there is in, say, the India-Pakistan ceasefire, or a few of the other alleged 7 conflicts that the president claims to have
I think
resolved.
it's 8 now.
Is it 8 now? Well, yeah.
It's going to be 12.
Gaza, of course. There were a few that weren't even wars until he said on stage that he had stopped them. But in this case, I think it's fair to say that the White House probably sped things up by 48 or 72 hours, and that's not nothing. But was not at the table when the ceasefire was being negotiated.
Okay. I want to turn to you, Henrietta, and just understand what the recent flare intentions, and I hope that's a terminology that's acceptable.
Half credit.
Thank you very much.
For context, for those who are not longtime State of Play listeners, on my first episode, when Will asked, what's the word you want to ban? I said amid rising tensions, comma, which is like how every U.S. China story is. Anyway.
It's also not a word. Several words.
It's an idea.
It is. Henrietta, the recent export restrictions that China has put up and the threats of retaliation from the U.S., can you just explain what's going on and how this is driving the sort of growing, gosh, it's so hard not to use the word tension now that I'm thinking about it. But please go ahead. You know what I'm asking.
So maybe just to start by taking a step back, because we're here to talk about ASEAN. So there is a perennial tension between ASEAN wanting to be seen by China, by the United States, by the powers of the world as important, a geopolitical player in its own right. ASEAN's about ASEAN. It's not about U.S. China. But then on the other hand, it's always sort of about U.S. China. And so this year, the big point of tension that's played out, maybe putting aside the broader sweep of the U.S. China trade war, and which would be a different podcast. So China announced recently a really significant set of new export controls regarding rare earth exports and certain battery technologies that effectively are China laying claim to authority over the entire global economy. And so this is in some ways continuous. China has been expanding the toolkit through which it can control rare earth choke points, not only the rare earths themselves, but the technology needed to produce and manufacture products from rare earths. They've been increasing those controls, the toolkit for imposing controls for some time. And of course, we all witnessed the significant pain to the U.S. economy and to the global economy when China really clamped down on those exports as part of the trade war earlier this year. The big new thing, in my view, is that China is asserting extraterritorial authority over these trade flows. So they're basically taking what has actually long been a U.S. tool, we call it FDPR, and saying anything with a Chinese component, or that has as a component even a really trace amount of Chinese rare earths, that is subject to regulation in Beijing. So big moves. President Trump responds quickly by saying he's going to impose 100% tariffs on China, control software exports, and maybe they won't meet in APEC after all. And so these Asia summits are often grouped together. So we have the ASEAN Summit in KL, and then after that, an APEC summit in Korea. And APEC is often the venue for big U.S.-China summits on the margins, or even small U.S. China summits on the margins. And so the expectation has been Trump will meet at APEC as part of this trip. And Trump says, well, maybe we won't. That lasted all of about not even 2 days, where you see both sides seeking at least tactical de-escalation in the relationship. Trump has this great line. Everyone should listen to the recording, I think on Air Force One, where he's asked if the meeting at APEC is going to happen. And he's like, well, I'm still going to be there. And she's still going to be there. So if we happen to siege, like, why not? Maybe, so, a lot of backtracking going on in China for their part is saying we want diplomacy. Of course, what the two sides are talking about is not the same kind of de-escalation. China's trying to lock in stability that includes these new sweeping powers over the global economy, whereas the U.S. wants that rolled back. Anyway, all that to say, my real point here that will bring us back to the ASEAN Summit is why is Xi and Trump, why do they have to meet at APEC? Why are they not meeting in KL? It's because Xi doesn't go to the ASEAN summits. He never goes to the ASEAN summits. He sends a premier. And the Chinese premier, kind of the number two in their system, the person who nominally runs the government, covers a lot of the diplomatic calendar for China. But this is important to me as a grievance because there is a huge amount of focus that goes into whether the U.S. president does or does not go to these ASEAN summits. It is often seen as the most significant strategic indicator of whether the United States cares about Southeast Asia, cares about the region, has staying power. President Xi never goes. This is never a conversation. No one's like, but hasn't the premier not had real power in a really long time? Anyway, so a bit of a double standard that I just wanted to call out here on State of Play.
I want to later on just circle back to that because that's sincerely so interesting. First of all, it's so fun talking about regions that get this much attention. I will say in the Africa space, sometimes we really struggle to get, one or two leaders to come. But before we get to that, Greg, I want to pull these two threads together. This peace agreement that, will probably be signed, as well as these growing trade tensions. What were the stated intended goals of the summit as of this morning? And do you expect that Trump attending the ASEAN Summit, as well as the growing tensions between China and the U.S., will that change the nature of this summit?
So I am not at all certain that a peace deal, not even really a treaty, a ceasefire 2.0 will actually be signed. The Thai prime minister has poured a lot of cold water on that. Trump last week said that he would only go to the ASEAN summits if he could oversee this signing. He also insisted that the Chinese representative, so in this case, Li Chang, is not permitted to be in the room, which is an awful lot of demands to be made of the host, which is Malaysia, not the United States. Anutin Charnvirakul, who's the current prime minister of Thailand, seemed to suggest that he wasn't interested in any further U.S. role in negotiation. Sounded very much like what we heard from the Indians after the U.S. claimed credit for the India-Pakistan ceasefire earlier in the year. He's softened that, but the Thais have a list of 4 preconditions set out that is basically a complete Cambodian withdrawal of all people and equipment from the disputed border areas before they will sign a new ceasefire. Now, maybe that's just a negotiating tactic. Maybe there will be some kind of signing, but this is not the focus of the summit. Nobody was talking about this until last week. I mean, of course, the aftermath and the still very shaky ceasefire after the fighting was going to be a topic of discussion within the ASEAN summit, because that brings together the 10 countries of Southeast Asia. And if 1/5 of those countries had just had a war, you have to talk about it in the room. But this whole showpiece of getting Donald Trump to scour as 2 people signed a deal, that was put in place by the Malaysian government in order to get him to come to the summit, which is something that Prime Minister Anwar already said he was going to do in July, which at the time I said is a dangerous proposition because you don't actually know. I still don't know for a fact that Donald Trump is going to the ASEAN summit. Let's be clear. And I understand that the advance team for the White House is already there. That does not necessarily mean that he is going. It means it's more likely than not. I think a lot of it still rests on whether or not he's going to meet with Xi. And I was not prepared to say he was going to the ASEAN summit until he announced that he would be meeting with Xi in APEC, because that's what he cares about, right? He cares about the showcase photo ops. He does not want to sit in the room at the East Asia Summit, in which there will be 19 countries present, and the ASEAN Summit, which will have 11, and listen to talk about the ASEAN Digital Framework Agreement and details
Whereas
of the South
I could
China Sea.
listen to the ASEAN Digital Framework for
Who among us
days.
couldn't? And also, I just want to note how much of Henrietta stealing my thunder just happened on arguing that the U.S. president shouldn't go to the ASEAN Summit, because this is a proposition that I
I'm
know.
not arguing he shouldn't go.
I raised
He should
repeatedly
go,
when you were in
but it shouldn't
government,
matter that
and
much.
I was just, a gadfly. I argued that it was silly to put this expectation on President Biden, and I wrote a commentary to that effect for CSIS that really touches the third rail of what you're supposed to do as a Southeast Asia hand. You are
Sure.
never supposed to suggest that ASEAN meetings are not the most important thing in the universe. And I wrote it down anyway, that the U.S. president should not go.
Arguably blasphemous.
I want to get to actually summitry, right, and what role they're playing in this Trump administration in Southeast Asia. But I do want to get to what Henrietta maybe just said in passing, which is if these leaders of ASEAN could actually just focus on what they wanted to talk about, what would they be talking about in 2 weeks in Kuala Lumpur?
So I'm reasonably confident of what the like top line outcome documents are going to be from the ASEAN side. So, right, so this is a whole series of meetings. You have the ASEAN leaders meeting, which will be the 11, because they'll be formally inducting Timor-Leste as the 11th member. So that's big outcome number one, growing the organization to 11 members. Then you have all of the +1 meetings. That's ASEAN and China, ASEAN US, or what's called the US ASEAN leaders meeting. Hopefully, President Trump will attend that. And then you have the East Asia Summit, which is ASEAN plus the most important dialogue partners. That's where you get the Americans, the Chinese, the Russians, the Aussies, all in the room together. And that's 19 members. I don't know how much of that the U.S. will attend. The only time Donald Trump has attended an ASEAN meeting, he attended the U.S. ASEAN meeting and then left early and didn't stay for the East Asia Summit. Very similar to the G7 earlier this year. So other big ASEAN outcomes, we expect ASEAN will finally conclude what they call the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement, which is supposed to be a big deal. Get them on the same page as far as kind of norms and standards around data privacy and data flows and things like that. We will get the upgrade of the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement to being called ASEAN-China 3.0. And I think there may be a big announcement on the ASEAN Power Grid, which is this long-standing dream of having a unified regional power grid to facilitate swapping electricity. So it's going to be a lot of kind of nuts and bolts deliverables that are not going to catch a lot of international attention, but I think matter a whole lot more in the context of the larger strategy we've seen from Southeast Asia under the Trump administration, which is to desperately seek to diversify economic relations in order to limit overexposure to either the U.S. or China, both of whom are equally destabilizing in different ways from the perspective of ASEAN governments.
Yeah. Okay. And if we have time, we can get back to how countries in Southeast Asia are hedging at this moment, because I think it sounds very similar to what's happening in Africa. But Henrietta, I want to get back to the point you were making about summitry, right? And the role that they play in this new Trump administration. I hear you and Greg saying that there has been a lot of attention paid to who shows up, who doesn't show up. Henrietta, I think you're saying maybe we're putting a lot of attention on the U.S. president and less on Xi, for example, who's never really shown up for the ASEAN conference. But what, in both of your opinions, what role do summits like these play in this new geopolitical age where, as blocs, as individual countries, everyone's trying to hedge their bets, everyone's trying to find new export markets, everyone's trying to find ways to diversify their economies? Are they still relevant, or is it just pageantry at this point? Henrietta?
Okay, so do summits matter? The answer is yes, but in different ways for different players. So if I were to be more charitable rather than indignant in reference to my prior grievance, it does matter more that the U.S. president show up to summits in Asia because the U.S. has something to prove. The U.S. has to demonstrate every day that it has an enduring, serious commitment to the Indo-Pacific, to its alliances, to economic engagement to Southeast Asia, because geography doesn't make that obvious. We have to say that clearly in ways that resonate with our regional partners and with China every day. And showing up to these meetings is a part of how you communicate that in a language that's meaningful to the region. China doesn't have to prove to anyone that China is an enduring part of the geopolitical landscape in Asia. It is there. So it does matter in a different way, though. I will say, there's no question that Li Qiang is going to the summit. I mean, China is very effective at establishing kind of their own rhythm of cooperation with ASEAN, with other regional organizations, even as they also create their own, to some degree, competing regional ecosystem through regional summits like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that we saw Xi host in Tianjin just a few weeks ago. And of course, President Xi generally always, with limited exceptions, goes to SCO. He generally, though didn't this year, goes to BRICS. So he does tend to personally go to the multilateral summits that are part of that new regional architecture that China is trying to build and legitimize, in part to push U.S. leadership out of the Indo-Pacific. But it's also there's a lot of debate over what does ASEAN centrality really mean. And so, everyone who works on Southeast Asia, Greg was talking about some of the religious dogma.
The catechism of ASEAN
Asia.
centrality.
It's like ASEAN is very central. It's like you have to say at the beginning of every conversation.
Right.
But so what does that mean? I mean, there's a geographic reality to that. But part of what ASEAN centrality means to me is that the middle powers of the Indo-Pacific, the ones that are most invested in a viable system of international rule of law, that in the rules-based international order, that those countries are the ones coming together to set the terms of engagement and the key norms for all nations' engagement in the region, including China, including the U.S., including the external players. And I think that is, never perfectly practiced, but even that as an idea is something that is very powerfully aligned with American interests, because there's only one alternative to ASEAN centrality, and it's Beijing centrality, and I don't want that. And so that's another reason why it does matter that U.S. leaders show up at the right level to these ASEAN meetings to lift up and legitimize an organization in a way of running regional governance that is really powerfully aligned with U.S. interests and an important part of why the region has seen such security and prosperity over recent decades.
Well, Greg, over to you. Similar question. I hear you saying that ASEAN countries are forming strategies to deal with these two dual, sometimes destabilizing forces in the form of the U.S. and China. Has a organization like ASEAN taken a new importance in this, destabilizing period, or has it lost some of its relevance and some of its abilities? And the reason I ask that, for example, the only through line I have is with African regional economic blocs, and they're struggling right now, right? There's been a lot of shifts in African politics. We have increasing instability, both in the forms of conflict, but also political strife. We just saw the president of Madagascar just get kicked out of his own country. So it's a lot of questions I'm throwing at you, but what role or how are ASEAN countries adjusting and balancing the U.S. and China in this period?
So there's a difference between how Southeast Asia is reacting and how important Southeast Asia is in the global order amid this rising tension between U.S. and China.
Henrietta.
There will be consequences.
and ASEAN as an institution.
Sure.
So the former is very easy to answer. Southeast Asia is and will, for the at least medium term, be the new driver of global growth. The region on par is growing considerably faster than China and is growing in terms of population, where China is not. The three fastest growing economies in the region are also the three largest and account for over 500 million people: Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. And so as other blocs, the EU, the Gulf, look to shore up and diversify their relations in order to maximize space and agency from a disruptive US and a disruptive China, they look to Southeast Asia. And we've just seen this huge proliferation of economic agreements and new negotiations starting just in the last 9 months, or things that have been long stalled getting new energy as everybody looks to both the US and China's destabilizing. So Southeast Asia's role as a major pillar of whatever rules-based order emerges is secure. Still unclear is whether or not ASEAN as an organization will help drive the norms and standards and institutions that are preserved in that order. On some fronts, probably. ASEAN has been remarkably successful in intra-regional standard setting, things like lowering goods tariffs, facilitating open skies agreements and labor mobility. ASEAN has had a far more scattered record when it comes to engaging external partners. And we've seen this already under the Trump administration. There was an ASEAN economic ministers meeting right after the Liberation Day tariffs were announced back in April, and they said, we're all going to pull together. And then they all tripped each other to try to be the first ones in to USTR offices to negotiate bilateral trade deals with the administration. So that's not a great answer, but I would say that institutionally, ASEAN has been somewhat adrift for more than a decade now. There is some hope in the region that this new destabilizing era in which they find themselves will be a shot in the arm to the organization. But I think that is the minority opinion. Most experts in Southeast Asia probably think that ASEAN will remain important for Southeast Asia, but not really the player in regional institution setting that they would like to see.
Well, I mean, I just want to pull on that thread a little bit more and zoom out of the region. We've seen. I'm really interested in this concept that you put forward, Henrietta, which is about the role of Southeast Asian countries in maintaining this international sort of liberal order, or at least norm setting. At the Sharm el-Sheikh peace signing yesterday, we saw leaders from Indonesia present in the quote-unquote Hague group that has formed in response to the conflict in the Middle East. We have Malaysia present. We've seen that in this coming ASEAN Summit, we have leaders from Brazil and South Africa present. I wonder if the new Trump administration has forced leaders in the region to push their ambitions beyond what they typically would be doing, or is this normal for the region? And I ask because, again, thinking about African countries, the uncertainty that has been wrought in this period has caused countries like South Africa, Egypt, right? We always forget that Egypt is an African country. It is a Middle Eastern country, but it's also an African country, to almost become the new enforcers of this weakened liberal international order. And so do you feel like countries in Southeast Asia, Henrietta, are expanding their scope beyond their region to look at conflicts around the world, even though, as Greg has mentioned, the relevance right now seems to be within the ASEAN bloc?
And frame your no in the most polite way you can.
You can, please.
All my years at the State Department are being drawn on to shape my no in the most diplomatic possible. No. So look, like you mentioned Indonesia, Malaysia, at the meeting in Egypt. Those, I mean, they have always had very strong positions when it comes to questions of Israel-Palestine issues. So some of that is more continuous. And I think the reality is that even looking just at the global economic picture, putting geopolitics aside, it's increasingly difficult to draw lines that are useful or really mean much between different regions of the world. I mean, we're looking at global opportunities and global challenges. And when you layer the geopolitics on top of that, I think it's even more true as the security of Europe, the security of the Indo-Pacific, the security other regions, I think, has become increasingly interconnected. So you'll see not just Southeast Asia reaching out to the rest of the world, but the rest of the world reaching in. Europe has made a big effort to expand its cooperation, not just with ASEAN, but the individual nations of the region, big strides with the Philippines and other players. And part of this is a China story as well. The U.S. May have become more of a revisionist player over the past few months in the region, but China has been working to build an alternative order for years, an order that would be more centered on China, that would be more friendly to its authoritarian system of governance, an order that builds in deference to China's parochial interests, for example, on Taiwan. And so pretty much every country in the world should have a reason to push back on that. Even those countries that benefit significantly from Chinese economic cooperation, and that's most of them, including the United States to some degree, I think have good reason to be concerned about the kind of leadership that China is increasingly explicitly saying it wants to hold, especially in its neighborhood, especially in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think that also is a driver of some of the cross-regional cooperation and engagement that you've seen this year.
I would add that what we do not see from ASEAN is any coherent, organized effort to engage with security or political matters either within the region or outside the region. So within the region, ASEAN still can't come to a unified position on the South China Sea disputes, which is the most dangerous security threat in the region. They cannot come to a unified or effective position on the civil war in Myanmar, which is, when one of the member states with somewhere between 50 and 80 million people is falling apart and the organization is just frozen. It doesn't speak well to their ability to engage externally. No shared position on Israel-Palestine, no shared position on the war in Ukraine. We have individual member states, particularly Indonesia under Prabowo, who I think views itself as a great power, and emergent middle powers, Vietnam being a good example under what the new General Secretary now calls the era of national rise. But none of them yet seem willing to either work with each other in a coherent way, or more importantly, to put any real skin in the game. It is easy for Anwar and Prabowo to go to, Sharm el-Sheikh and stand up for a domestically extremely popular and unified position on Palestine. But they do not do that on Xinjiang. They do not do that on Russia-Ukraine. They do not do that on the South. They don't do it on any issue where they might actually have to pay some costs, the cost of global leadership. So it's if you are only going to engage on the things that are easy, then you're not really helping carry the burden of global leadership yet. I'm hopeful that changes, but it hasn't yet.
Fascinating. I mean, this really applies a lot to the African region. I haven't heard it be put as succinctly as you just did. To wrap up, I like to end the Into Africa podcast with just a question on what would you have wanted me to ask you today, and why does that matter? I'll start with you, Henrietta. the friend of the pod, the star of the pod, Henrietta.
Well, we haven't really talked about the India angle here, which is an interesting one in that India is a dialogue partner of ASEAN. It has a chair in these East Asia Summit meetings and is a player that I think ASEAN often wants to see more of. And India, for its part, I think has seen engagement with Southeast Asia, especially expanded commercial engagement as, to some degree, a hedge against over-reliance on China, even as India and markets like Vietnam, Malaysia are to some degree competitors when it comes to trying to attract investors out of China to their own markets. And in KL, it will be really interesting to see how the India-China relationship is looking, how the India-US relationship is looking at a moment when there have been incredible strains, I would argue, for almost no reason except U.S. intransigence on the U.S.-India relationship, where a lot of trust has been burnt, even as I think both sides are looking for an off-ramp from what is now a 50% tariff rate from the U.S. on India. And then on the China side, you have seen significant but incremental steps towards rapprochement between India and China after years of very high level of tensions that originated with border disputes, but also just divergent visions of what Asia should look like. And all of that's going to come together in one room at the East Asia Summit. And you'll see all of these players competing for the affections of Southeast Asia and trying to represent themselves as the best partner, the best leader, and a country that can be trusted for partnership at a time of incredible global change.
And I would note that assuming that there is not a Quad leaders meeting in India in November, that President Trump doesn't go, then his chance to meet on the sidelines of the East Asia Summit with Modi in KL will be more significant than it otherwise would have been. I would pull these two summits together and ask, what do ASEAN leaders want to see of the Trump-Xi meeting in APEC, which will happen just a couple days later? And I think what you're going to see is a lot of effort to message on the sidelines about what they would like President Trump to do, or more importantly, not do when he meets with Xi. There is a lot of anxiety in the region about the chance of U.S.-China trade tensions getting worse in ways that undermine the whole global trading order. But there are equal anxieties about the idea that President Trump might sell our other partners in the Indo-Pacific out in exchange for a U.S.-China deal. So in places like Vietnam, where Trump is less popular than he was at the beginning of the year, but still quite popular because he's viewed as anti-China, as tough on China. The threat that somehow China could end up getting lower tariff rates in Vietnam would completely undermine Vietnam's economic model. In the Philippines, the thought that Trump might set aside longstanding U.S. commitments in the South China Sea in pursuit of some kind of grand bargain with Xi is pretty worrying. And so you're going to see Southeast Asian states, I think, eager for kind of a Goldilocks answer. They want Trump to not make things worse, but please don't make any big swings at a U.S.-China condominium of power in the Indo-Pacific, because that would be even worse for Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and it will be. It's such a good point, because it'll be so important for Trump to take his participation in the ASEAN meetings as an opportunity to say explicitly, I am not selling out your interests to China, which seems like a silly thing to say, but in this moment where there's so much uncertainty and it feels like everything's on the table, the sequencing here could actually be very helpful for the United States to have a chance to sit down with all of our regional allies and partners and say, your interests matter when it comes not only to our bilateral partnership, not only here at ASEAN, but it also matters in how the U.S. will conduct U.S.-China diplomacy, including at APEC. And I think that could make a really big difference in starting to rebuild a little more trust in the direction of travel when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship.
Very beautifully put. Thank you so much for your time and generosity with your knowledge, and for walking me through what is, I'm now expecting to be a very interesting summit. And Greg has very kindly brought his band starter kit to play us out. So Greg, over to your, musical prodigy skills, please. you don't have to. Thank you, Greg. And thank you as always to Sarah, our wonderful producer. And Will, I hope you feel better soon. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.